March 1945. Europe was in ruins, but the war was not yet won. Cities smoldered, villages lay abandoned, and roads were choked with the wreckage of retreating armies. From the snowbound forests of the Ardennes to the plains of western Germany, the Allies had clawed their way east, step by bloody step. Yet in front of them now rose a barrier that seemed almost timeless, a natural fortress that had defied armies for centuries. The Rhine River. It was no ordinary river. Stretching more than 800 miles from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea, its waters flowed deep and fast, wide enough in places to swallow whole divisions. In March, its currents surged with snowmelt, its banks swollen and treacherous. To the German High Command, the Rhine was the last unbroken shield of the Reich. And in 1945, Adolf Hitler proclaimed it exactly that. He told his people that the Allies would never cross, that the river would be the moat protecting the fatherland. German engineers had reduced every crossing to rubble, detonating centuries-old stone bridges and modern steel trusses alike. Flames and wreckage marked every town along the banks. Searchlights swept the waters at night. Artillery was ranged in, and machine gun nests dotted the river's edge. The Wehrmacht clung to the hope that this final wall could stall the inevitable collapse. The mythology was not new. Since Roman legions stood at its edge, staring into the forests of Germania, the Rhine had been both frontier and fortress. Napoleon's armies struggled here. Even in the First World War, the thought of the Allies reaching the Rhine carried dread. Now, in the final months of the Second World War, it stood once again as a dividing line between a collapsing Reich and the advancing armies of democracy. Yet across the Western Bank, among the mud, smoke, and wreckage of war, a different vision took shape. American commanders knew delay would cost them dearly. The war had already dragged on for 6 brutal years, and every week lost meant more lives spent in combat. Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and Courtney Hodges pressed for speed. The Rhine could not be a wall. It had to become a doorway. But how? Every bridge lay in ruins. Airborne assaults risked catastrophe. A frontal crossing under German fire threatened slaughter on a scale not seen since the Somme. The answer would not come from tank commanders or bomber squadrons, but from men whose battlefield tools were not rifles and bayonets, but cables, pontoons, and steel beams. American combat engineers, the quiet architects of war, were given the impossible task. In secrecy, under cover darkness, they prepared to turn trucks into bridges, rivers into roads. What the German High Command considered unthinkable, these men planned to do overnight. When dawn broke, German officers scanning the waters would see what they thought was a miracle. Entire American divisions marching east. Sherman's rumbling across a bridge that had not existed hours earlier. Their faith in the Rhine's invincibility would shatter in an instant. This is a story of how American engineers outwitted the Reich. Not with overwhelming firepower, but with ingenuity, sweat, and courage. A story of how the Rhine, once considered impassable, was conquered overnight. The Rhine was not merely a river. It was history in motion, a ribbon of water that had shaped Europe for 2,000 years. To the Romans, it was the edge of civilization, the border between their empire and the wild lands of Germania. To medieval kings, it was a lifeline of commerce, its currents carrying wine, grain, and iron from the heart of the continent to the sea. For centuries, poets and generals alike spoke of the Rhine as more than geography. It was destiny. For Germany, it was identity. Songs and legends celebrated it. Painters immortalized it. And by the 20th century, the river had become a symbol of permanence. Adolf Hitler understood this deeply. To him, the Rhine was more than water. It was a fortress provided by nature, a boundary line that would halt the invaders. In speeches, he promised the people that the Allies would never cross it. And in 1945, he staked the fate of the Reich upon it. By that spring, the Nazi Empire was collapsing. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in August 1944, liberated Paris, and surged through Belgium. In December, Hitler had gambled everything on a desperate counterattack. The Ardennes Offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. It had cost the Allies dearly, but ultimately failed, leaving Germany bled dry of fuel, armor, and men. Now, as winter thawed into spring, the front line pressed ever closer to the Rhine. American and British armies, advanced across western Germany. Behind them, French units secured Alsace and Lorraine, while Canadian forces pushed through the Netherlands. Every road, every river crossing led east and toward the Rhine, yet the retreating Wehrmacht carried out Hitler's ruthless orders: leave no bridge intact. From Koblenz to Cologne, steel arches were reduced to twisted wreckage, their shattered spans collapsing into the water below. Smoke drifted over the ruined towns, while civilians trudged east, refugees in their own land. To the Allies, the Rhine was both obstacle and opportunity. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower understood its significance. If they could not cross quickly, the Germans might reorganize and prolong the fight. But if they succeeded, Germany itself would lie open, its industrial heartland exposed. Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, warned that hesitation could cost weeks, even months. Courtney Hodges' First Army, already battered from the Ardennes, knew the burden would fall heavily upon them. The river itself was a fearsome challenge. At some points, it stretched more than half a mile wide, with currents swift enough to sweep away boats and barges. Its banks were mined, its approaches raked with artillery, its skies patrolled by the last remnants of the Luftwaffe. Any crossing would mean men exposed on open water under fire with little cover. Military history had shown that such attempts often ended in disaster. Yet time was running short. Every day the Allies delayed gave German forces east of the river precious breathing room. They could regroup, fortify, and perhaps launch yet another counteroffensive. The Rhine was not just water. It was the last chance for Germany to stabilize a hopeless war. And so, in early 1945, the responsibility shifted, not to the riflemen storming trenches, nor to the tank crews dueling Panthers and Tigers, but to the combat engineers. These men, trained not only to fight but to build under fire, carried the weight of victory on their shoulders. The river that had stood for centuries as a barrier of destiny was now theirs to conquer. West of the Rhine, the landscape looked less like the edge of a mighty river and more like a graveyard of armies. The fields were sodden with rain and churned into mud by endless convoys. Roads buckled under the weight of trucks, jeeps, and tanks. Shell holes cratered the countryside, while half-destroyed villages stood silent, their church spires shattered. It was here, in the gloom of early 1945, that America's combat engineers prepared for one of the most audacious undertakings of the war. To the casual observer, their convoys appeared ordinary, rows of trucks lumbering through the mud, tarpaulins covering their cargo. To German reconnaissance, these movements seemed unremarkable, but the truth was far more dangerous. Hidden under canvas sheets were prefabricated bridge sections, pontoons, and heavy timbers. Each truck was not just transport. It was a bridge waiting to be born. Training was relentless. In nearby rivers and flooded fields, engineers rehearsed every movement, sliding pontoons into the water, anchoring them against the current, lashing beams together with cables, and locking steel decking across the top. Each task was timed, refined, and repeated. Officers pushed their men to shave off seconds, for they knew that on the Rhine, every heartbeat could mean a life. The work demanded strength and precision. Men learned to unload a truck in darkness, to hammer pins with frozen hands, to shout over the roar of artillery. They practiced building in silence, where even the strike of a tool was muffled for fear of discovery. More than once, entire sections collapsed in training, pontoons tipping into icy water. But mistakes here, in the mud, were lessons bought cheaply. On the Rhine itself, errors would cost blood. The engineers understood the risks. When the crossing began, they would be exposed on open banks, silhouetted by explosions, with German guns already zeroed in. Artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire would rake the shoreline. Any delay, any collapse, could turn the attempt into a slaughter. Yet despite the danger, morale ran strong. Soldiers joked grimly that they deserved double combat pay, for they carried rifles like infantry, but also bore the weight of steel and timber like laborers. German intelligence noted the convoys, but their analysts dismissed the threat. They believed that throwing a bridge across a river as vast as the Rhine would take days, perhaps a week. They calculated that the Americans would first need to secure bridgeheads with infantry, then painstakingly erect pontoons under protection of artillery and air power. What they could not imagine, what they would never prepare for, was that entire bridges could rise overnight. Behind the rehearsals lay secrecy and discipline. Orders were whispered, timetables kept close. Engineers camouflaged their materials beneath hay and tarps, their trucks disguised as supply transports. Patrols were forbidden from speaking of their training. Even among frontline infantry, few understood what the engineers were preparing. But the officers knew. Eisenhower's plan demanded speed. Bradley and Hodges impressed upon their engineers that every hour gained could save thousands of lives. The Rhine was not simply another obstacle. It was the doorway into Germany itself. The faster it was breached, the sooner the war could end. And so, in the muddy fields west of the river, with rain soaking their uniforms and cold numbing their hands, America's engineers rehearsed the impossible. Every rope they tied, every beam they laid, was preparation for a night that would change the course of the war. The night of March 22nd, 1945, was cold and still. A thin mist clung to the Rhine, turning its waters into a black ribbon beneath the pale glow of the moon. Along the western bank, shadows moved quietly. Columns of trucks inching forward without headlights, their engines muffled, their drivers straining to see the faint outlines of the road. Inside those trucks was the secret of the coming dawn. Bridges hidden under tarps, waiting to be assembled. At precisely 2,100 hours, the silence broke. American artillery erupted in thunder, hurling thousands of shells into the opposite bank. Explosions rolled like continuous thunderclaps, churning the earth and masking the engineers' movements. German defenders, blinded by dust and flame, hunkered down in their bunkers, uncertain whether barrage signaled an attack or a feint. On the shore, the trucks halted. Tailgates dropped. Men leapt into the mud, hauling heavy pontoons and beams. Orders were shouted, ropes pulled taut, metal clanged against metal. Pontoons were dragged into the icy current, their flat hulls rocking dangerously as engineers scrambled aboard. Waist-deep in freezing water, men hammered pins, bolted planks, and lashed cables with numb fingers. Some cursed as the current tore tools from their hands. Others worked silently, their faces grim, knowing that hesitation meant death. Above them, the battle raged. German artillery found its mark, shells screaming into the water and tossing geysers skyward. Entire sections of bridgework buckled under near misses. Men were thrown into the river, their cries lost to the roar of explosions. Still, the work continued. Engineers pulled comrades from the current, then returned immediately to hammering steel into place. Discipline held. Chaos threatened, but order persisted. By midnight, the outlines of the bridge began to take shape, a fragile spine stretching across the Rhine. It was still incomplete, still vulnerable, but it was there. Hour by hour, the river yielded to human will. Under the moonlight, trucks disgorged more sections, like puzzle pieces sliding into place. At intervals, American infantry slipped across in assault boats, paddling furiously under fire, establishing tenuous footholds on the far bank. Their job was to silence machine guns, to push back defenders who might otherwise annihilate the bridge crews. Many never returned, but each small victory bought the engineers precious minutes. By 400 hours, exhaustion set in. Men's uniforms were soaked, their boots filled with water, their shoulders bruised from hauling beams. Some collapsed on the banks, gasping, only to rise again when an officer's voice barked them back into the current. They knew what was at stake. Every soldier in the First Army, every tank, every truck waiting behind them depended on this work. And then, as the first hints of dawn glowed on the horizon, the impossible stood revealed. A complete bridge stretched across the Rhine, sturdy enough to carry trucks, tanks, and columns of men. What had been an empty shoreline hours before was now a gateway into Germany. Soldiers crossing that morning described their awe. Exhausted engineers leaned on their tools as Shermans rumbled onto the span, the timbers groaning under their weight. The men who had built it overnight watched in silence, pride mingling with disbelief. For the Germans, the shock was immediate. Reports streamed into headquarters. The Americans had crossed. A bridge now stood where none had been the night before. The myth of the Rhine's invincibility had been shattered before their very eyes. As dawn broke on March 23, 1945, the Rhine no longer belonged to Germany. The rising sun revealed a sight that stunned even the Americans who had labored through the night. There, stretching across the swift current, was a bridge where hours before there had been only darkness and water. Its pontoons rocked with the flow, its timbers groaned with strain, yet held firm, a fragile but unbroken lifeline from west to east. The first Shermans rumbled forward, their tracks clattering against wooden planks. The sound echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability. Infantry followed in long columns, rifles slung, eyes wide with both fatigue and wonder. Engineers stood aside, soaked to the bone, watching with quiet pride as their creation bore the weight of an army. They had fought with hammers and cables instead of rifles, but their victory was no less decisive. For the Wehrmacht, the psychological blow was immediate. The Rhine had been more than a military barrier. It was a promise. Hitler himself had sworn that the river would never be breached, that the Allies would break against it as so many armies had before. To German soldiers on the East Bank, the crossing was unthinkable. Yet now, before their very eyes, American tanks and infantry poured across. Entire units wavered. Some fought with grim determination, but others surrendered in droves, their belief in victory shattered. Reports raced up the chain of command. Generals who had assured Hitler of the river's impregnability now faced the unvarnished truth. Panic rippled through staff headquarters. How had the Americans done it? How could they have raised an entire bridge in a single night? Calculations had insisted on days, even weeks. But the truth was undeniable. By the time German officers fully understood what had happened, the Allies were already advancing inland. Strategically, the consequences were catastrophic. The Rhine had been Germany's last major natural defense line. When it breached, the Ruhr, the beating industrial heart of the Reich, lay exposed. Eisenhower wasted no time. Orders went out to press forward with all speed. Entire divisions began streaming across, exploiting the momentum bought by the engineers' courage. For German civilians, the sight was equally crushing. Villagers awoke to see endless American convoys crossing where no bridge had stood before. Hope that the river might spare their homes evaporated. Fear set in, but also resignation. The war that had once promised victory on distant fronts had now arrived on their doorsteps. Among the Allies, elation was tempered by exhaustion. Engineers collapsed on the banks, too tired to celebrate. Many mourning comrades lost artillery or swept away by the current. Yet they understood what they had accomplished. In a single night, they had not only built a bridge, they had dismantled a myth. The Rhine, once the symbol of German permanence, was now a pathway of Allied steel. The psychological impact rippled through the Reich like a shock wave. Morale crumbled, resistance faltered, and the Wehrmacht, once the most formidable army in Europe, now staggered under the weight of inevitability. The door to Germany was open, and through it would march the armies that would end the war.